In this video, I am going to break down the differences between monocrystalline, polycrystalline, and flexible solar panels so you can decide which one actually makes sense for your setup. Let's start with the basic visual difference. Monocrystalline panels usually appear darker, almost black or deep blue. If you look closely at the individual cells, you will notice the corners are rounded. That rounded shape is not for design. It comes from how the silicon is manufactured. Polycrystalline panels, on the other hand, are typically lighter blue. Their cells have a more square appearance and the edges are not rounded in the same way. Some people even choose between the two based purely on how they look on a roof or vehicle. Now here's something important. If you compare two panels with the same power rating, for example 100-watt monocrystalline and 100-watt polycrystalline, you may notice that the poly panel is slightly larger in size. We'll explain why in a moment. But first, let's understand how these panels are made. Both types are made from silicon, which originally comes from silicon rocks. The process is complex and involves extremely high temperatures. For monocrystalline panels, a single silicon crystal seed is placed into molten silicon heated to around 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As the crystal seed is slowly pulled upward, a solid cylindrical structure forms. This structure is called an ingot. That ingot is then sliced into thin wafers, and those wafers become the solar cells. Polycrystalline panels follow a similar starting point. The silicon is melted at the same high temperature. However, instead of pulling out a single crystal, the molten silicon is poured into a mold and left to cool naturally. Because it cools as multiple fragments join together, the final structure contains multiple crystals instead of one single crystal. That is why you can see grain patterns in polycrystalline cells. And this difference in crystal structure directly affects efficiency, which we'll talk about next. Now let's talk about performance. In general, monocrystalline solar cells are more efficient than polycrystalline cells. That means they convert a higher percentage of sunlight into usable electricity. Now here's something that confuses many people. If you buy a 100-watt monocrystalline panel and a 100-watt polycrystalline panel, both are rated at 100 watt. So technically, under ideal conditions, both can deliver the same maximum power output. But because monocrystalline cells are more efficient, they require less surface area to produce that 100 watt. That is why a polycrystalline panel usually needs to be physically larger to reach the same power rating. So if you compare dimensions from the same manufacturer, you will often see that the poly panel takes up more space. This becomes very important depending on where you plan to install your system. If you are working with limited space, like on a van roof, a boat, or a small off-grid cabin, every square inch matters. In that situation, monocrystalline panels are usually the better option because you get more power in less area. However, if space is not a limitation, for example on a large house rooftop or ground-mounted system, then polycrystalline panels can still do the job perfectly fine. Now let's briefly talk about cost. Years ago, there was a noticeable price difference between mono and poly panels. Polycrystalline used to be significantly cheaper per watt. But with improvements in manufacturing technology, the price gap has become much smaller. Today, in many markets, the difference per watt is minimal, so the decision is no longer just about price. It often comes down to space efficiency and personal preference. As for durability and lifespan, both types are very similar. Modern mono and poly panels typically offer comparable performance in normal conditions, including partial shading. There is no dramatic durability advantage of one over the other in standard use cases. Now let's talk about flexible solar panels. Flexible panels are lightweight and can bend slightly, which makes them attractive for certain installations like curved surfaces or temporary setups. However, there is an important downside. Because flexible panels do not have a rigid aluminum frame and glass covering like traditional panels, they are not as effective at dissipating heat. When solar panels heat up, their efficiency drops. Excessive heat over time can also reduce lifespan. Rigid panels allow better airflow and heat management. Flexible panels, especially when mounted directly onto a surface with no air gap, tend to run hotter. As a result, flexible panels often have a shorter operational lifespan compared to standard monocrystalline or polycrystalline panels. Many users report noticeable performance degradation after only a few years, especially in hot climates. So here is the simple summary. If you are limited on space and want the highest efficiency per square foot, go with monocrystalline. If space is not an issue and you want a slightly lower upfront cost in some cases, polycrystalline can still be a solid choice. And flexible panels should only be considered when weight or surface shape makes rigid panels impractical, not as a long-term primary solution. At the end of the day, the best solar panel is the one that matches your space, budget, and installation type. This is Michael from Battery Hacker. If this video helped you understand the real differences between mono, poly, and flexible solar panels, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.